My talk is meant to, follow Dr. Kemp's, and I'm going to talk about sort of the science of human evolution, and then I'll touch briefly on Neanderthals because the next talk is going to be on Neanderthals and whether they had souls. So it sort of flows kind of nicely because I'm going to hit a little bit on that as I go through. So. I'll give an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So the first part of my talk is just sort of a general overview of the hominid fossil record, just to give you an idea of sort of the patterns that you sort of see there, right? So a hominid fossil is just any fossil that's more similar to modern humans than modern chimps. And the whole idea of the mosaicism, the migrations, and the hybridization that you see in the fossil record. The second part is where I'm going to try to find and put some dates on where and when sort of theological humans may have emerged in the fossil record. So what Dr. Kemp was talking about, as well as when do biological humans emerge in the fossil record. And looking at the fossil record, what is the pattern that you see there? What's the archaeological record pattern that you see there? And then the third part, just sort of speculation on how sort of my own personal speculation based on the data of how humans may have emerged. Okay. So what I have up here is a picture that goes over just sort of a general overview of hominid evolution in the last 7 million years. And just to give like a 30,000 feet view of this, I sort of break it into 3 phases, and I'm going to focus on the last phase. But you can see the first phase is from about 7 million years ago to roughly 4.5 million at the base of the tree here. And there's not much in the fossil record down here. Right? There's very few fossils, not as much known. Most of the fossils are just one single bone that's been found that makes up that species and so forth. So it's not really clear that much what was going on there. And then you hit the second phase, which is the African diversification phase. And in this phase, you have a whole host of fossils that you find that are exclusively in Africa, hominid fossils, from about 4 million years to 2 million years. All right? And I'll talk a little bit about those and about the pattern that you see there. And then the top of the tree, the top of this, the third phase is the migrations out of Africa. So you still have fossils in Africa, but then about 1.8 million years ago, although there's some evidence maybe it was a little bit earlier than that, you're the first hominids leaving Africa, and then you have wave after wave of hominins leaving Africa. At the same time, you have a whole bunch of stuff also still going on in Africa in hominid evolution. Okay? Now, one of the things you notice from this picture here is there's a lot of question marks there. Right? There's a lot of question marks of how these species fit together. And that is sort of the messiness of hominid evolution, right? And so, I teach these courses to undergraduates. They come in with this idea that, oh, this is how evolution works. This is a gradually nice, neat linear. A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D. And that's not the case at all. So in many cases, it's not a clear A goes to B. It's like, oh, we have a group of fossils. We're not really sure whether they're the same species or they're different species. You have sort of mosaicism. And so it's hard to tell sometimes whether one fossil species is more derived or more advanced. So I'll give you a couple examples of that. Okay. So here are 2 fossil forms, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, which are contemporaries. So they're in this phase, that second phase, the sort of the African diversification phase. All right. And you can see them here on this picture. You have habilis and Homo rudolfensis. They're contemporaries of each other. And if you look at some of their characteristics, you'll find that habilis is more modern in certain characteristics, and rudolfensis is more modern in other characteristics. You have this mosaicism going on. So if you look at their physique, rudolfensis is more robust, a more human-like skeleton, and it's taller. All right? But if you look at the jaws and the teeth and the face, habilis is more similar to modern humans, has a smaller jaw. Right? So if you look at the brain size, rudolfensis is more close to modern human brain size. Modern human brain size around 1,400 cc's. Right? So it's not as if in one respect, rudolfensis is more modern. In other respects, habilis is more modern, right? Another thing about this, habilis is, if you actually compare habilis to some of the Australopithecus lineages, there's people that argue that habilis should be reclassified as an Australopithecus. It's not diverse enough to be classified as in our genus Homo. So you can see, because of this mosaicism that you have in these fossils, there's a lot of debate about how to classify them, how to split them, and so forth, right? Another example of this is a recent one, Homo naledi, which was a recent fossil find. This one is dated to 200 to 300,000 years ago. And you can see it's about 1.4 meters tall, but if you compare it to habilis, it actually has, on average, a slightly smaller brain, even though this one is 2 million years more recent, right? And so again, you don't have a neat linear increase in brain size going on. But what you do have, and if I go back a few slides, if you say, hey, what's the biggest brain hominid around here, right? It's going to be smaller than the biggest brain hominid you have at 2 million years. And it's going to, if you compare 2 million years versus 1 million years, you're going to have a bigger brain hominid at 1 million years, than you did at 2 million years. Although you will have some species that have smaller brains, but you have this sort of this mosaicism that's occurring there. Right? And part of that is, I want you to think about, not only did humans were migratory, but most hominids were, whether they were in Africa and migrating through in different parts of Africa, or as you have humans, other hominid species leaving Africa. And as they leave and as they move, they keep bumping into other hominid species. And there's good evidence that when they do this, they interbreed, right? And so then you get these hybrid forms, these mosaicism, and so, and then you get fossil forms that are very difficult sometimes to delineate. This book, I would recommend it to people that are interested in this topic. David Reich, who, it's about 4 or 5 years old now, the book, but this is a book he wrote about the sequencing of ancient genomes. So finding DNA in 10,000-year-old bones, 8,000-year-old bones, even further, and being able, the technology now to separate that DNA from the microbial DNA that was actually in those samples and actually sequence this ancient DNA, gives us a lot better picture of what was going on as these populations might migrate. And one of the things that the takeaway from this book is whatever hominid population was present at a certain period of time, what follows them is often a hominid population that moved in from a different area. So if population was here 1 million years ago, well, who was there 800,000 years ago? It wasn't this population. Somebody else came in and displaced them. And so it's really makes things a little bit more difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. And so this is just an example from the book about modern humans spreading out of Africa and encountering Neanderthals, right? And so this happened multiple times, right? So a lot of you are probably aware that the major migration of modern humans out of Africa was about 60,000 years ago. That's the wave that spread throughout the rest of the globe, and all of us have descended from that wave that are non-African. But modern humans left Africa before that. So modern humans were found in the Middle East, here in the top, about 100,000 years ago, maybe 1,200,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, and they encountered Neanderthals then. Right, who migrated in from the Neanderthal world, and so they encountered them, and then this population that left 60 to 70,000 years ago, as it moves into the Middle East, also encounters Neanderthals. So again, as these populations move, they keep encountering other hominid populations or other human populations, and so and we also know not only do they encounter them, that they interbred as well. Right. And so if you look at this, you see that there's gene flow that's going between these hominid populations. So it makes it more difficult to discern exactly when a hominid population started and when another one ended and how diverse they are, right? So we know that this is sort of the known Neanderthal world, most of Europe up and through the Caucasus here in this picture. And when that wave of modern humans leave Africa about 60,000 years ago, they interbred with Neanderthals in the Middle East. And so all of the non-African humans still carry some of that Neanderthal DNA, roughly 2%. And everybody has that Neanderthal alleles are in different portions of your genome. It's not like, oh, this portion is the Neanderthal portion for everybody, right? And so that's not only the case with Neanderthals, but there's Denisovans these modern humans encountered and interbred with as well, right? And so when you find Neanderthal, you find bones that have been sequenced with this ancient DNA sequencing technology, you find, if you look at the DNA, it's about 12% Neanderthal and 88% human. So this is like a interbreeding event like 2-3 generations down, right? So you see this mosaicism, which then is going to make the fossils sometimes more difficult to interpret. The other thing that you see over and over again in the fossil record is both the convergence in hominin evolution, where you see sort of the same sort of forms emerging in multiple species, and you also then see a lot of morphological variation, which then can make it very difficult to distinguish one fossil species from another, right? And just to give a quick, quick example, I'll just focus on this one here. This is the morphological variation you see in Neanderthals, right? So this skull here is a Neanderthal skull from 400,000 years ago. This one here is a Neanderthal skull from about 70,000 years, much more recent, okay? And they're both Neanderthal skulls. You recognize that there's a very prominent brow ridge that's the typical of Neanderthal skulls. But you notice this one has a much bigger brain capacity than this one, right? So this one is about 1,200. This one is 1,450, a little bit close to humans, even greater than humans. You also can see this one has a broader face. This face, the cheekbones are a little bit narrower. So there's morphological variation in the Neanderthals if you look further back in time. So they don't have the same exact sort of anatomy as you go through space and time. Similar thing if you look at, the jawbone. This is a more modern human mandible. This is sort of a Neanderthal mandible. But you can see that there's a lot of morphological variation, and there's an overlap in that variation with other hominid species. So there isn't, when somebody pulls out a bone and says, oh, I think this is a Neanderthal bone, it's not surprising that there's another person that writes articles, no, that's not a Neanderthal bone, that's Homo erectus, right? And so there's because of that variation that you find there. Okay, all right. So with that in mind, sort of that messiness, what you see in hominin evolution is you see more like a bushy tree, right? So it's not a neat linear passage, it's more of a bushy tree. We have this experimentation in sort of hominid forms going on over time, and out of that bushy tree eventually emerges one species that sort of dominates. And that's not unusual if you look at the fossil record. If you see at the origin of tetrapods, right? What you see is almost like a bushy tree. At the origin of tetrapods, you go back 350,000 years ago, you see all these forms that are starting to adapt to land. They're all weird looking. It's not clear how they all relate. And out of that comes one well-adapted form. So this is not something that's sort of necessarily unique, that mosaicism to the hominid fossil record, okay? So what I want to do in part two is try to find where do humans show up in the fossil record. Where can we find both biological humans and theological humans? So Dr. Kemp made that distinction between a biological human and a theological human, right? So biological human is something, scientifically we could categorize as Homo sapiens. It has a certain structure or morphology, and we'd say it could interbreed with other Homo sapiens, right? And what can we know about this from the fossil record, and also what can genetics tell us, right? And you say the fossil record is going to be able to reveal certain things to us, but there's going to be certain things that the fossil record is going to suggest, but we're not going to be able to pin down, because in terms of classifying fossils, there's always some subjectivity to it. And certain people have different biases of whether this should be classified as Homo sapiens or not, whether this should be classified, this fossil should be classified as Neanderthal or not, right? So there isn't some table to go look up, and if you have this exact brain shape, you are now human, right? You're biologically human. So there has to be sort of judgments that the researchers make. Right? So we'll look at that first, and then I want to look at how can you find the first theological humans, those made in the image and likeness of God, right? And what can we know about that from the archaeological record, right? And so if we look at the archaeological record, what can we find there that suggests these are the type of creatures that had rational conceptual thought, right? And so we'll do that second. But first, we'll start with the fossil record and what we can know from that, okay? So a lot of sort of simpler version, you see this in textbook maybe 20 years ago, was the idea that modern humans emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, and then spread throughout Africa, and then spread throughout the rest of the globe from there. So you have this one site, it was East Africa, that's where things were happening, right? That simplistic notion, it doesn't hold water anymore, okay? So what we look at in the fossil record, if you look to try to find the earliest fossils that would be classified as Homo sapiens, you find that those fossils are showing up all over Africa, right? These traits that you would expect with modern humans show up not only in East Africa, say get that, here in Ethiopia. So this up until about 10 years ago was the oldest sort of fossil that was thought to be modern human. It was dated to, now the date is about 220,000 years. So this slide says 195, but roughly 200,000 years ago in East Africa. But you also have found modern human fossils now in Morocco that have a brain size that's basically the same as modern humans, that's dated to 300,000 years ago. Right? You also have this fossil fluorspathe in South Africa that has a very modern sort of brain size. It's dated to 260,000 years ago. So you see these early modern human-like brain sizes showing up all over Africa, not in just one privileged spot, okay? So this is sort of what we see. So I just want to touch base on all of these different ones. So the fluorspathe one is probably the one that's most controversial. It's probably, most people seem to think this is not necessarily a modern human based on sort of its overall features. It has a modern human brain size, it's at about 1,400 cc's, but it has a very much a mosaic features that have some human features, but others that are more similar to Neanderthals or Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis was a species that thought to have given rise to Neanderthals and eventually to modern humans in Africa. So the frontal bone has traits that are human in terms of its overall shape, but it's a little bit broader like Neanderthals, right? And then the parietal bone, the one on the side, it's a little bit more robust. This one has a more robust sort of cheekbone here than sort of modern humans have a more fragile cheekbone. So it's got this mosaic features, even though it has a brain size that's about the same as modern humans. Okay? Now the ones in Morocco, there was a bunch of these found. I think there were 7 or 8 of these. And if you look at them, okay, so this is one of these fossils that was found in Morocco. This is dated to 300,000 years ago. This was back in 2017, so it's relatively recently. And this is a modern human skull. Okay? So if you look at them, the brain size is about the same, right? Basically about 1,400, 1,450. But if you notice, the brain shape is quite distinct, right? So the brain shape here is much more globular, so the brain's sort of more stacked on top of each other, where here the brain is more elongated, more spread out, right? And this more elongated brain is the type you see in Neanderthals as well. So you can see these brain cases here. This would be a modern human brain, more globular, more stacked on top of each other, and this one's more elongated. Right? And that's the Moroccan fossil. So the question is, it's got about the same brain size, but it's got a distinct shape. And if you look here at this is taking a paper where they took a bunch of different early human brains and tried to classify them based on shape. Okay, so all of them have roughly the same brain size, but based on the shape. And you can see in one, the 3 brains that are in so this is modern human shape here, all right? This one here is these fossils that are found in Morocco, as well as those ones that are found in East Africa, right, the 200,000 years. You can see they have a relatively distinct brain shape that's more similar to Neanderthals and Homo erectus, right? So even though they have a big brain size, their shape is not modern. These ones, number 2, these are human brains that are about 120,000 years old. Some of them are found in the Middle East, some are from Africa, and they're getting very, very close to present-day human shape, right? And then these ones in 3, they're all ones within the last 30 to 40,000 years in the fossil record. So you can see you see modern brain size 300,000 years ago, right, for these fossils, but you don't see modern brain shape until roughly about 100,000 years ago, right? And so the shape, the organization of the brain is key. You don't see that until relatively recently, okay? Now, this idea that modern humans emerged, in the simple model that modern humans emerged here in East Africa and then spread throughout the rest of Africa, also is sort of challenged by some other evidence in addition to the fossil evidence. Okay, so one of the things people have heard of like mitochondrial Eve, where they take mitochondrial DNA from all different living human populations, and they'll sequence it, look at the pattern, and put it on a tree, and try to trace back the maternal ancestor of everybody, the maternal lineage, right? And if you do that, there's different assumptions that people make, but mitochondrial Eve, sort of the mothers of all of us, was dated to about 150 to 200,000 years ago. Okay? Now, again, this is not the first woman. This was one woman in the population at the time who just so happened that her mitochondrial DNA is the one that's made it on to all modern humans. The other women, their mitochondrial lineage went extinct over time. But the interesting thing, it assembles a tree that looks like this, okay? And so here's the base of the human tree. And so the earliest branch is between sort of the San population of in South Africa and the rest sort of the African population. So people say, oh, there's this split, roughly about 200,000 years ago between, South African and, the rest of Africa. So maybe the modern humans emerged before that. Well, the interesting thing about this tree is that the rest of it doesn't sort of segregate spatially, right? And so you have close to the San, who are down in South Africa, the Hausa, which are up here in northern Nigeria, right? And then some of these other African populations are here in Central Africa, right, that are more distantly related. So it suggests that there's been some migration and gene flow that's occurred over time. So this population, we haven't had a split, though. Here's the South African population, here's the rest of Africa, and there's no gene flow between them. But there has been, and so that's why you get this sort of non-sort of spatially segregated pattern there, right? So it's going to be more complicated than just, humans emerged here in East Africa and then spread out throughout but there's going to be gene flow going back and forth, right? I think this is a paper that, again, was taking advantage of the sequencing ancient genomes. So what they did is they sequenced, a variety of living, genomes from different populations in Africa, but they also sequenced a number of ancient genomes between 2,000 and 8,000 years old from different fossils that they had found, recent human fossils that they found in Africa. And then they tried to model how these populations sort of evolved, right? And so what they had is, so here's an East African population, a South African population, they had a couple West African populations. And when they did this and they model it, they find that this West African population, this was in Sierra Leone, was more diverse than these other populations. And so there was a couple ways to make sense of that. One was to say, well, maybe the humans emerged earlier and there was a deeper split, maybe 300,000 years ago, this West African population split from the rest. But the model, the data that they had also fit with a model that there is, a populations that are migrating and sharing DNA. They weren't isolated. So you have an East African population, you have this East African, South African split, and then some of the East African population split to West Africa, but this far West African population was genetically isolated. Whereas West African 1 was having gene flow exchange with East Africa or some extent with South Africa. So they look more similar even, and the West African population looked more distinct because they hadn't had as much gene flow because they're more isolated, right? And so that model actually fits the data. So the idea is that you've got different hominid populations maybe in different portions of Africa, and they're migrating back and forth and sharing gene flow. Some of them are more isolated than others, and that fits the data as well. And it seems, given the fact that we know that there is a lot of migration going on with these different populations, seems to fit maybe what was going on at the onset of human emergence in Africa. And I'll come back to that in a few slides. What I want to talk about now is the theological humans, the emergence of those. So what can we know about that, right? So we can't know much about that from just looking at the fossils, looking at bones, but we can know a little bit about that by looking at the archaeological record, looking at signs of things that are going to be things that might be associated with rational and conceptual thought. And the interesting thing is you see a very similar pattern, all right? The timing is a lot delayed, but you sort of see a similar pattern. So with the fossil record, you see modern human forms starting to crop up all around Africa. There's no privileged spot. There's migration moving back and forth through Africa. And similar things we're going to see here with the archaeological record. There doesn't seem to be a privileged spot where everything starts here and it spreads out from there. It starts to pop up all over Africa and the Middle East, and then it sort of takes off at a certain point in time. Okay, so what are we going to look at? So there's three things that I want to just focus on to look at here. The first is composite tool use. The second is sort of ritual and jewelry, and the last is art. Okay? These are things that you would suspect at a certain level may only be associated with some species that have rational and conceptual thought. Okay? So just to frame this, so we know that sort of the oldest modern humans are somewhere in Africa, emerging around 200,000 years ago, based on sort of the fossil evidence throughout Africa. All right, and so up until this time, the dominant sort of tool technology was the Acheulean tool technology, and you can see pictures of it. You have these hand axes that are here, and then you have these flakes that have fallen off. All right, so the Acheulean tools are basically, you take a rock and you start hitting it to flake things off, and then you create the tool is what you've just flaked off. All right, and so. Up into about 200,000 years ago. Again, these are really rough dates because depending on the locale, it changes a little bit. But you see a switch, all right, from this to three different things. Okay, what you see is this new tool technology, the Vellele method, where it's a little more cognitive complex. So instead of having, a rock that you chip off, right? They first shape the rock and then flake off the entire tool. And so you had to cognitively think, I want to shape the rock this way, and then I'm going to flake off a big piece. Right? And they were able to make thinner and more precise tools that way. And so these are some examples of that. Okay? And this really starts to take off 300,000 years to 50,000 years ago. So right around the time that modern humans emerged. Now, this is not a technology that is only associated with modern humans. It's also associated with Neanderthals as well. So that you find in Europe, this method was being used. Now, so a couple other things that happened at this time. You start to see a lot more blades. Now, blades are not unique to this time, but the blades are things that are basically defined as twice the length as they are breadth, these flaked tools. And they start to be sort of one of the dominant tools that you find. You see them sporadically before this, but they sort of take off here. And one of the other things that you see is hafting techniques. You see composite tools, right? And there's a lot of debate about this and when they emerge and how they emerge and so forth. So what is, these hafting techniques? It's where you take, a blade and you attach it to usually a wooden shaft, and there's some animal hide, and there's a resin there, right? Now, how do you find that in the fossil record? Because usually all you find is the tool. The blade decomposes, it doesn't fossilize. So there's a lot of debate about when the earliest composite tool. Some people say it started 400,000 years ago, but there's very good evidence about 200,000 years ago. But you actually see tools that have resin on them, right? And that's a really good sign, right? The other way that they identified is based on the wear pattern on the rock. So if you attach the rock to a handle, it's going to have a slightly different wear pattern, and the marks and the strikes on it is going to be different than a hand axe, right? But that's a little bit more controversial. But at about 200,000 years ago, you do see these tools with resin on them. So composite tools, and that's going to be more cognitively complex to say, okay, I'm going to take this piece, put this on there, and have a resin and put four things together. You have to have sort of a concept of what your end goal is there. Okay. Now, another thing that emerges about this time is widespread pigment use, the pigment ochre, which is this reddish iron-based pigment. Okay. Now, again, there isn't necessarily a privileged place. Oh, it all starts here. All right. Now, ochre is this is a list of sites, archaeological sites where where you have the triangle, you can see there's been ochre that's been found in that site. And so sometimes it's a whole block of ochre, sometimes it's like a smaller ochre, like a pencil type thing. It's obviously not a pencil, but a more thinner piece of ochre. Sometimes you see ochre on like shells that are covered with ochre and so forth. So this sort of suggests these pigments some type of ritual use, right? So there is the possibility that ochre could be used just functionally to repel insects or to have to prevent skin damage or something like that. But there's also evidence, particularly when you see it on shells and covered in shells, that it has some sort of ritual use, all right? And it's interesting, the pattern to me of of how ochre use expands in Africa. And so this graph sort of shows it here. I think it's better illustrated in this slide, okay? So about, half a million to 330,000 years ago, there's only a few sites where you find ochre here, both in East Africa and in South Africa, but very, very few. There's almost never, very few sites are found. About 330 to about 150,000 years ago, it starts to pick up. And the bigger the circle means they found more ochre at that site, right? And then from 150,000, 160,000 years to the 40,000 years, you find it all over Africa, from South Africa to North Africa to East Africa, and you see tons of ochre use. So you have this sort of habitual explosion of ochre use at that same time. These things are starting to overlap when you see the emergence of that modern brain shape. You see widespread ochre use. You start to see hafting technology and tools. But again, you don't see it all. Oh, that's the place in Africa it starts. It seems to start all over the place. Right? Similar things, pattern you see with jewelry. Right? So with decorative jewelry. Right? So you find this in a variety of different places. Again, roughly around the same time. About 50,000 years ago, you start to see in sort of East Africa these ostrich egg shells that are pigmented and structured to make sort of a decorative jewelry. And you find them in both East Africa, and you also find them in South Africa. Right? And it seems to be, based on the technology, there was exchange of these and migration of hominids, of humans in this time as well, exchanging these from East Africa and South Africa. But you also see this down, other examples of this. You see down in South Africa, one of the most famous examples, Blambo's Cave, where you find ochre use with these hatch marks and sort of almost like decorative writing on them. But you also see these shells that have been drilled, precisely in the same location, one after the other. It's thought to be sort of decorative jewelry, right? But again, you say, okay, it's down here in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. That's pretty close. Maybe that's where it all started. But there's also evidence in the Middle East, right? In Levant, there's a paper that came out, it's about 20 years old now, but they had found jewelry or found shells that have these holes in them as well. And these were found, I think about 15 miles from shore. So they'd been transported, right? So they didn't just sort of wash up on the beach. So you have now this sort of ritual jewelry, but again, it's showing up around 50 to 100,000 years ago, but it's showing up in multiple locations. Again, not a privileged site. So you see this sporadic mosaic in nature, this archaeological record, and there's, again, no privileged location, right? And then about 50,000 years ago, you see a big change, right? And this is where it becomes sort of unambiguous. Like, okay, these are things that are made by people that have rational conceptual thought. And you find it all out throughout the globe, right? So it's not something that you find just in one spot. You find it everywhere. From Indonesia, both of these are cave paintings in Indonesia from 40,000 years ago, Namibia from 30,000 years ago, and then Europe 40 to 35,000 years ago. So you see this explosion. There's no sort of, again, no privileged place. It seems to be very, very widespread. Okay. The same thing with symbolic thought, although that comes, these little signs that you see are found throughout Europe, also throughout Africa. They're much more recent, but again, there's no privileged location. Okay. So finish just talk about how might it all happen, given that sort of the sporadic nature of and the mosaic nature of the fossil record. How might the first humans have emerged, right? And I think one of the most likely scenarios is something like this. You have the existence of distinct biologically human populations in Africa, right? So you have this population, East African population, Southern African population, and they're migrating back and forth. And as these populations migrate back and forth, they combine, and you have sort of gene flow between two populations, and their offspring then are the type of thing would be known as theologically human, right? So the example here, you have certain mutations or certain genetic differences between population A and B. When they migrate and interbreed, their offspring then become the type of thing that is capable of rational conceptual thought, right? So it's not as if, everything is evolving here, but a little bit's evolving here, a little bit's here, and then you bring those populations together, right? And they're able to interbreed. And we do know that these populations are migrating and interbreeding. Eventually. And some of these offspring here possess a unique set of genetic and epigenetic factors that they are the type of thing that would be considered a theological, capable of theological human. So these first theological humans would be conceived sort of in the womb of these biological humans. So these biological humans come together, they interbreed. The offspring are the type of thing from the very first moment of their conception is the type of thing that's fitting to be ensouled by a rational human soul, right? So you don't have the sort of, we got to get one mutation and then the next mutation here, but it's a more rapid thing of sort of a hybridization event. Things that we've been able to document in the record as hominids move or as humans move throughout the planet, right? And so these first theological humans, as Dr. Kemp had talked about, would be structured within a biological population, right? So as these two populations come together, some of them would be the type of thing because of the genetic makeup that they would be theological human. Others would be biological human. So they're structured in that population, right? As Dr. Kemp talked about, there's different ways in these populations can evolve, right? So the idea of having, generation one, this would be sort of after these two populations come together, you have a monogenic origin. You have two individuals, and they start to give rise to their offspring. And these are the theological humans, and these are the biological humans, and they don't interbreed, right? This idea, though, doesn't make sense genetically, right? And so that's what Dr. Kemp sort of illustrated. So if you have a population, just started by two individuals after 100 generations, there's going to be a very distinct genetic signature, a very low genetic diversity, a high amount of linkage disequilibrium, and you don't see that in the human population, right? So the human population, you see a higher amount of genetic diversity, lower linkage disequilibrium. That indicates that we didn't start from a breeding population of just two individuals. We started from a breeding population of multiple individuals, and that's where Dr. Kemp talks about the idea that, these first theological humans that emerge are mating with just biological humans. For me, I have them in green, and then after time, the theological humans sort of take over the population. And so, just in conclusion, what can we sort of summarize from what the fossil record and what the archaeological record sort of indicates? The oldest biological humans are found in Africa. Exactly when is debatable. Which ones of those fossils are actually biologically human, based on the shape of the brain, okay? The fossil data does indicate that they sort of emerge in a mosaic fashion throughout Africa 200 to 300,000 years ago, okay? And the genetic data also suggests that these populations were not fully isolated, that they're probably connected by gene flow to some extent, right? And then we see signs of rational conceptual thought emerge about 100,000 years ago, right? And again, it's a sort of a rough estimate. People will debate about that because some people have different views of what sort of signifies rational conceptual thought. And I would argue that until you have that decorative jewelry seems to be, to me, the best sort of first evidence of rational conceptual thought. Doesn't mean it wasn't there before, right? Because it just might not have been manifest in the archaeological record. But I think the best signs of it are about 100,000 years ago. But again, it's concentrated in and around Africa, but there's not a privileged site. But then those signs become very, very evident 50,000 years to the present, and they're spread throughout the globe with those paintings. Okay? So I would argue that theological humans emerged in Africa in the last 100 to 250,000 years at some point, and then they likely interbred with other biological human populations in Africa, and then eventually spread out of Africa, and then interbred with other biological human populations outside of Africa, and eventually displaced all those populations. So some of this, I had my book, it just came, this came out, Darwin and Doctrine. There's a chapter on this. There's a chapter on what Dr. Kemp was talking about. So if you're interested in this, I have some of those tonight if you can take a look at those. But happy to take some questions now.
I have a question more on the behavioral aspects. Is there any evidence of multiple care among individuals as a fundamental step in overcoming the ontological gap between other hominins and Homo sapiens?
Is there evidence of care, biological?
Evidence of mutual care among individuals.
Yeah, I mean, there is evidence of, you see, it's seen in Neanderthals where you have sort of deformities in the skull, or humans where it's clear they sort of cared for people that have defects, right? That have had an injury, right? And they've lived to a longer age, right? So you see that in certain human populations in the fossil record, and there's some evidence in the Neanderthal fossil record that you have sort of a fractured skull, but it's not someone but they've lived beyond the fracture is sort of healed, right? And they probably were cared and taken care of by the population that they were in, right? Yeah, so you do see that, but whether that's rational conception, thought, but is that something you need to have a rational conceptual thought to do? I don't think so, necessarily.
Thank you.
I think chimps, other hominids could have done that as well without that. Two questions over here.
Question.
Oh, sorry. We'll do this one first and then come over here.
Thank you. Two questions, please. Would you care to speculate if Neanderthals may have been ensouled? And the other one is genetically, when there are very few individuals in a population, they can be considered functionally less a single individual because there's such little variation, genetic variation. So would that address the issue of mono versus poly?
Yeah. So the next talk is going to talk about whether Neanderthals had a soul or not, right? And so I did there was a picture up here. It's this Neanderthal art. I sort of skipped over that just because the next talk. But this artwork down here, that picture is thought to be generated by Neanderthals. Whether you need a soul to generate that picture or not, I don't know. And the fact that humans interbred with Neanderthals, and to remember, Neanderthals that existed 400,000 years ago probably had different capabilities than the Neanderthals that existed 40,000 years ago. So it's a more complicated question. I would say no, but I do let Dr. Bagel is going to talk about that in the next talk. And then I think this idea that modern humans emerge from two populations that sort of interbreed creates a large gene pool from which those modern humans are emerging from, rather than just a very small isolated two individuals or a small isolated population, which helps establish that population.
Thank you for your talk. Two kind of technological questions, and I'm not a biologist, so one has to do with carbon dating and how you come up with all these many numbers, and the second one is about how you genetically. So first of all, my understanding is the human skeleton is carbon. It's a calcium. So, and I would think there's no genetic material in the calcium. So unless there's some kind of actual soft tissue related, maybe I don't know. How do you date how do you date accurately when carbon-14 is only accurate to maybe order of 10 to the fourth power, so about 10,000 years or so? And then secondly, how do you get genes from just calcium bone remains?
Yeah. So I mean, the dating, like they're dating the tuffs, like volcanic flows above and below where they find the bones. So they know, the ones that were found in Ethiopia that are thought to be 200,000 years old, they're right below a volcanic tuft that's dated to 195,000 years old. So that's how they do that. Yeah, using like uranium and other isotopes in the volcanic flows to date them, and then other stratigraphic means. But in terms of the DNA, that's one of the biggest surprises. People thought, I mean, the bones have cells and they have DNA in there as well as calcium, so there's cells there, but people, there's no way we're going to be able to get the DNA from these ancient bones. But it's it's amazing the technological advances that they'll be able to take them, grind up pieces of the bone, and most of the time they don't get good sequence, they don't get good DNA. But then, they have little probes that are attached to like metal pieces or magnets that have human DNA to fish out the human DNA and wash away all the bacteria DNA, because it's usually 99% bacterial DNA and only less than 1% human DNA. And then they try to sequence that. And so, it's amazing that they've been able to do that with bones that are 50,000, 40,000 years old. Most of the time, they're not successful, particularly when you find bones in Africa, because of the conditions in Africa. It's more likely to degrade than finding bones at a northern latitude, where they're more likely to be the DNA is more likely to be preserved intact, or at least some of the DNA.
Thank you. Can you talk about like where the emergence of language would play a role here, and like is that something that we can historically date in any way?
The emergence, is that something that?
The emergence of like language and like human language, is that something that we have like an idea also like historically when that would have happened?
Yeah, so the emergence of human language is the question. Do we have any idea of when that might have happened and how that could have occurred? And I think you're making, you have to make secondhand conjectures, and so a lot of people say, well, when you get to composite tool use, and you're trying to put these together, maybe you need some type of language to communicate with the people around you. When you see artifacts that are made from like obsidian, and we know the obsidian had to have been exchanged from 200 miles away. Then people go, well, maybe there must have been some language to do some trade or to migrate. It's very much you're inferring things that sort of secondhand. One of the things I do mention about Neanderthals and language, there's a paper that came out. It was a very interesting. Not only did they pull out the DNA, they were able actually to look at methylation patterns in the DNA. And so these epigenetic methylation patterns, and they compared it to human methylation patterns. And they found that the methylation patterns for genes that are associated with language were totally different in the Neanderthals, which suggests that they might not have had the language in the way we do, right? Their methylation patterns were totally different. It's a really amazing technological ability that they were able to do that. So, in terms of language, that's one way to do that. Yeah.
Hi. Oh.
I don't know who had their hand up first. So I know
Thanks, Dan. I have a question that's maybe a little bit broader in scope, and obviously not being an expert in any of this, my question is more, if you think about the variability between, say, humans that live in different parts of the earth and whatever number of variables you want to put there.
Yeah.
So who we would definitely call a human, and the size of the variability there, how different is that between these different species, and how much is do you think there's any like definitional details that get us stuck in this conversation where we say a Homo sapiens has to be the point at which the Genesis story happens? Are we stuck there? Are these totally separate things? The distance between those different species and where we define this is now a human being.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that we have. I mean, that's the whole problem of defining a species and what is a species, particularly in the fossil record, is just fraught with problems. It's just not something that it's a subjective judgment. What is the shape of the brain that you have to have, the minimal shape, to say this thing is a Homo sapien? There is no table to go look that up at, right? And so if we look at all modern humans, we have the same shape, right? The same globular structure. Whether you're African, Caucasian, you have the same. You look in the fossil record, you don't. You find brains that don't have that same globular structure, right? They're more elongated. They look more like a Neanderthal elongated brain. But it's the same size. Their facial structure looks more similar. They don't have the prominent brow ridge of Neanderthals. So there's a lot of features that they look more like modern humans, but the brain shape is a little bit different. Is that should we call that a biological human? I would guarantee that it could interbreed with us, right? Given the fact that we know we can interbreed with Neanderthals, but should we call it a biological human based on its structure? Nobody, unless you find that thing standing in the cave painting something, I don't think we can really tell, So, and it's a subjective judgment. And there's people, again, people have different philosophical, theological biases. Some people want everything to be as close to human as possible and want to go back. Oh, the first humans are 500,000, 600,000 years old, and you see people making those arguments, and then. I'm more of a skeptic until I see that the thing can paint pictures. That thing is not. I'm going to be skeptical of it. Yeah.
Hi, Heidelbergensis. Oh, can I go? Heidelberg. I'm back here.
Oh,
Heidelbergensis. It's supposed to be a close relative of both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Can you
Right.
talk a little bit more how they fit into the picture?
Yeah,
Were they
Homo
in Africa?
heidelbergensis is a species that's only found in Africa, at least as far as we know. It's only found in Africa. And it was, they existed in Africa about 700,000 years ago, roughly. And so the Homo heidelbergensis group that left Africa around 500,000 years ago gave rise to Neanderthals. Right, so that was a wave of hominins that leave Africa, give rise to Neanderthals. The Heidelbergensis that stayed in Africa are thought in some way, shape, or form. Again, there's a bunch of question marks. Somehow gave rise to these human populations that you find in Africa. So it did give rise. Again, the Homo heidelbergensis that stayed in Africa gave rise to modern humans. Those that left Africa gave rise to Neanderthals. Yeah. Okay. So.